She shouldn't be here. That's what they all thought when Grace Wells walked into the ballroom she once helped build. The chandeliers shimmered, the cameras flashed, and the whispers. Those always came first. The wife who smiled too politely. The woman who stayed too long in a man's shadow. They called her background, decoration, proof of his success. But what no one saw, what no one ever saw, was that every light in that room existed because of her. The contracts, the words, the empire, all built by the hands they now refused to shake. Grace didn't argue. She didn't need to, because this time, she hadn't come to be seen. She'd come to be remembered. They laughed at her absence. They'll regret her return. Stay with us. Because the night they tried to forget her name was the night she became unforgettable. This is the story of Grace Wells, erased, replaced, and finally reborn in her own light. Where are you watching from? Drop your city below. Have you ever been replaced, only to come back stronger? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Black Stories Untold with love, and ring that notification bell for more heartwarming stories that celebrate strength. Grace Lee Wells had become an expert in disappearing. She learned it the slow way, through dinner parties where her words floated unheard, through meetings where her presence was acknowledged but never included. In rooms that glittered with wealth, she'd become part of the background decor, pleasant, quiet, necessary only for appearances. Her husband, Richard Wells, the celebrated visionary of Wells development, never noticed her fading. Or perhaps he did and found it convenient. His name filled every conversation. His laughter carried across every table. Hers? It was the soft echo no one turned to hear. Grace had met Richard long before the world called him a genius. Back then, he was a man with ideas and not enough money to fund them, driven by ambition that burned through sleep and kindness alike. She believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. She edited his proposals at the kitchen table, handwritten drafts that smelled of coffee and exhaustion. She typed his first business plan on a second-hand laptop, corrected his grammar, strengthened his arguments, and built the foundation of the empire that now carried only his name. She did it because she loved him, and love, she once thought, was reason enough to stay unseen. But invisibility takes its toll. The Meridian Gala was proof of that, a glittering celebration of innovation and excellence, held in a ballroom dripping with chandeliers and arrogance. It was the night everyone important would gather to celebrate themselves, and Richard had been chosen as Man of the Year. Grace had ironed his suit 3 times, making sure every line was perfect. It wasn't for vanity. It was habit, the quiet reflex of a woman who took pride in details, even when no one noticed. She smoothed the silk lapels and told herself this time would be different. Maybe tonight he would remember her hand in his, the years they built something from nothing. Maybe tonight she wouldn't have to stand behind him. Richard stood in front of the mirror adjusting his cufflinks, his reflection sharp, precise, almost unfamiliar. "You don't need to come," he said casually, as though discussing the weather. "It's going to be a long night." Mostly business. Grace looked up from fastening her earrings. "I want to be there," she said simply. "You've worked for this." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that closed doors instead of opening them. "You mean, we worked for this," she added softly. But he didn't answer. His silence was an eraser, wiping her out sentence by sentence. When he left the room, Grace sat on the edge of their bed for a moment, letting the quiet stretch. The city lights poured through the windows, reflecting off the wedding photo still hanging above their dresser, him in his rented tuxedo, her in a borrowed gown, both radiant with belief in a shared future. Now, years later, that photo felt like a ghost haunting a home filled with strangers. She stood, smoothed the silver gown she'd sewn herself, and whispered to her reflection, You belong. The words felt foreign, heavy, but necessary. She picked up her clutch, slipped the invitation inside, and walked toward the door. Outside, the night air was cold, the kind that reminded you you're alive whether you want to be or not. Cars lined the curb, engines humming, lights flashing as chauffeurs opened doors for women in gowns that shimmered like liquid diamonds. Grace clutched her shawl tighter, steadying her breath. She wasn't going to wait for permission anymore. Tonight, she told herself, she would walk into that ballroom not as Richard's accessory, but as Grace Lee Wells, the woman who built an empire and was about to find out what happened when the world pretended she didn't exist. The December wind bit through her dress like punishment. Grace tried to keep her posture straight, her chin lifted, but humiliation is a weight that makes even good posture collapse. The guard's words kept replaying in her head. Mr. Wells is already inside, with his guest. For a second, she thought she had misheard him, that maybe there'd been a mix-up with names or timing. But when she looked through the glass doors again, there he was. Richard, his hand resting lightly on the small of Victoria Lane's back, guiding her toward the cameras. The same hand that used to steady Grace when life felt uncertain. Her breath caught, half freeze, half panic. The street behind her buzzed with limousines and laughter, the soundtrack of people too rich to notice small tragedies happening at their feet. Grace opened her clutch and pulled out the cream invitation card with the gold lettering. It had her name printed clearly, Mrs. Grace Wells. The letters gleamed like proof of existence. "I'm on the list," she said again, this time louder, firmer. The guard sighed, glancing between the paper and the tablet in his hand. "Ma'am, I don't make the list. I just follow it. Please step aside." The words landed harder than they should have. Step aside. She'd been stepping aside for years, at board dinners, photo ops, interviews where Richard's story began with, "I had a dream," and never mentioned, "We built it together." She thought she'd made peace with it, but peace built on erasure never lasts. It cracks under the smallest truth. And tonight, the truth was standing 10 feet away in a red gown with a man Grace no longer recognized. The doors opened as another couple arrived, laughter spilling into the cold air. For a heartbeat, she could see the world inside. The chandeliers, the champagne, the circle of people orbiting around her husband like he was the sun. The light hit Richard's face just right, catching the edge of his perfect smile, the one she had coached him to practice in the mirror years ago. He didn't look toward the entrance. He didn't see her. Or worse, he did, and chose not to. Grace's throat tightened. She swallowed the bitterness rising in her chest and forced herself to breathe. "Please call someone," she said softly to the guard. "You can confirm with the coordinator. I belong here." The guard hesitated, maybe hearing something in her voice, dignity, desperation, or both. He picked up the radio clipped to his shoulder, murmured into it, then waited. The minutes stretched. People swept past her like she was invisible, perfume and laughter and money moving through her like wind. Each second chipped away at what was left of her composure. After nearly 15 minutes, the guard nodded reluctantly. They confirmed. "You can go in, Mrs. Wells." His tone had softened, but the damage was done. Grace thanked him quietly and stepped toward the revolving doors. The glass was cool beneath her fingertips. For a brief, foolish moment, she hoped Richard would turn, see her enter, and remember the woman who once believed in him more than he believed in himself. But when she walked into the ballroom, no one looked up. The air smelled of luxury and lies. The orchestra played something soft and slow, and at the center of it all stood her husband, laughing as if she were a ghost that had already faded from memory. Grace straightened her back and walked further inside, her heels clicking against marble, echoing louder than her heartbeat. The invitation in her hand was useless now, but it didn't matter. She was here. She'd opened the door they tried to close, and before the night was over, someone in this room was going to remember her name. Grace had walked into many rooms where she was meant to shrink, but none had ever felt this cruel. The Grand Meridian's ballroom was a cathedral of ego, gold ceilings reflecting men who thought themselves gods. Waiters floated past like ghosts carrying crystal flutes, and laughter swirled through the air like perfume. At the center of it all was Richard, framed perfectly beneath the chandeliers, his tuxedo tailored within an inch of perfection, his charm polished for the cameras. Grace's gaze found him instantly, as it always had, but what she saw this time made her stomach twist. He wasn't alone. Victoria Lane sat beside him in a scarlet gown that looked poured onto her skin, her posture effortless, her smile rehearsed to suggest belonging. One of her manicured hands rested lightly on Richard's arm, claiming space that Grace had once filled without thinking. They looked coordinated, like two halves of a photograph she hadn't been invited into. Grace froze for a heartbeat, her breath catching between disbelief and recognition. Then, with quiet composure that felt borrowed from someone stronger, she moved forward. No one stopped talking. No one paused to greet her. She was a shadow passing through spotlight. Every spouse sat proudly beside their partner. Everyone except her. Grace noticed the empty seat that should have been hers at the main table, replaced now by a woman whose perfume she could already smell. Her pulse thudded in her ears. For a moment she thought she might turn around and leave, disappear again into the quiet safety of invisibility. But something heavier kept her rooted, the kind of dignity that refuses to die, even when love does. Richard turned as she approached. His smile flickered, just long enough for Grace to see the panic behind it before he covered it with charm. "You shouldn't have come," he murmured under the swell of music, his voice low enough for only her to hear. Grace's lips parted, but the words stuck in her throat. "It's your night," she managed finally. "I came to celebrate you." He leaned closer, the scent of his cologne, once hers to choose, filling the small space between them. "You don't understand. This is business. You don't fit in here anymore." The words hit harder than a shout because they were said calmly, deliberately, like a truth already settled. His hand grazed her elbow, a gesture that looked polite to anyone watching but carried the pressure of dismissal. Grace felt the air around her tighten. She could hear snippets of laughter, the clinking of glasses, the murmur of deals being made. Every sound seemed designed to remind her that she didn't belong. Victoria turned then, her red lips curving into something between pity and triumph. "Grace, what a surprise," she said, her voice sweet enough to rot teeth, soft but steady. "Yes," she said, "I'm full of them." She didn't cry. She didn't make a scene. Instead, she took a single glass of champagne from a passing tray and lifted it slightly in Richard's direction, a silent toast to endings disguised as celebrations. Then she moved through the crowd, past familiar faces that pretended not to know her, her heels clicking in rhythm with the string quartet. Every step was an act of rebellion, a quiet refusal to vanish completely. At the far end of the ballroom, near the exit, Grace paused and turned back one last time. Richard was laughing again, already recovered, already rewritten into the perfect photograph of success. Victoria leaned in close, whispering something that made him smile. Grace let the image burn into her mind, not as pain but as clarity. She finally understood. He hadn't replaced her tonight. He'd been practicing it for years. And as she stepped out of the room that had erased her, the cold air outside felt almost merciful. It was the kind of chill that wakes you up. The applause felt like a storm she couldn't escape. It roared through the ballroom, drowning out the last fragments of the woman Grace used to be. She stood near the back, her champagne untouched, watching as Richard mounted the stage beside Victoria Lane. His smile was radiant, teeth catching the light, his posture perfect. Every inch of him looked like success carved from marble. And yet, as he took the microphone, Grace saw it, the performance. She'd seen him rehearse that same expression in their living room years ago, back when he still asked her to help him sound believable. "Visionary of the Year," the CEO announced, voice booming with pride. Cameras erupted, capturing the man who'd built an empire on borrowed brilliance. Victoria clapped first, her hand brushing his arm possessively before looping through it as if sealing their partnership in public view. Together, they looked flawless, the powerful man and the dazzling woman at his side. Grace knew how carefully that picture had been crafted. She'd been the one who taught Richard how to control the narrative, how to turn charm into currency, and now she was watching him spend it all to erase her. She told herself to breathe. The music swelled as Richard began his speech, thanking mentors, investors, and the incredible team that had made his success possible. He spoke with eloquence that once would have made her proud, but every word that should have included her absence was a blade. He didn't mention her name, not once, not the woman who'd written his first proposals or stayed up nights correcting his grammar, not the teacher who'd paid the rent when his first venture failed, not the wife who believed in him before anyone else could spell his name correctly. Grace stared at him and realized something devastating. He wasn't ashamed of forgetting her. He'd planned it. The applause thundered again when he finished. People rose to their feet, toasting to ambition, to brilliance, to the illusion of integrity. Grace's palms stayed still. The sound around her blurred until it was just noise, meaningless, hollow noise. She saw Victoria lean close to whisper something in Richard's ear. He laughed. It was the same laugh that used to fill their tiny apartment when they had nothing but love and stubborn hope. Now it sounded like a stranger's. When the lights dimmed and the crowd began to disperse toward the bar, Grace remained where she was. She couldn't feel her legs, only the sharp edges of humiliation pressing into her ribs. People brushed past her, glancing without recognition. A few nodded politely, mistaking her for staff. It would have been easier to leave quietly, but she didn't. Not yet. She waited until Richard stepped off the stage, shaking hands, accepting compliments, completely unaware that the woman who had built the foundation under his empire was about to take it back. He didn't see her slip through the side exit toward the hallway leading to the offices. He didn't notice when she used the same access badge she'd once helped him register, still active under her name because he'd forgotten to revoke it. Inside his private suite, where deals were signed and secrets were stored, she found the folder marked Private Accounts. She opened it, her hands trembling only slightly, and saw everything: transfers, shell companies, false statements, evidence of greed disguised as brilliance. When she walked out of the Grand Meridian Hotel later that night, the wind had turned colder. Her heels clicked against the marble steps, each sound sharp and certain. Behind her, the laughter and applause continued as if nothing had happened. But Grace didn't look back. She didn't need to. In her clutch was the flash drive that carried proof of the man Richard Wells truly was. For the first time that evening, Grace smiled. Not with bitterness, but with something steadier. The humiliation hadn't destroyed her. It had clarified her purpose. Tonight he'd erased her name from his stage. Tomorrow she'd make sure the world remembered exactly who built it. The city was still half asleep when Grace returned home, the sound of her heels echoing through the empty penthouse. The building was quiet, too quiet for a place that had once held laughter and music and midnight ideas shared over takeout containers. Now it felt like a museum of someone else's success. She slipped off her coat and stood in the living room, staring at the skyline Richard loved to brag about. The glass walls reflected the city's glow, and for a moment, she wondered how long she'd been living inside a man's reflection instead of her own life. She moved to his office, a space she'd rarely entered anymore. It used to smell like paper, coffee, and ambition. Now it reeked faintly of arrogance and expensive cologne. His desk was spotless, every surface too polished, too intentional. She sat in his chair, the one he said she never understood how to use, and turned on the computer. The login was still the same, a password she'd created for him years ago because he kept forgetting. Typical. The drive connected instantly, pulling up folders labeled with dates and project names she recognized. At first, she skimmed through them with detached curiosity, but the deeper she read, the colder she became. Contract after contract, revisions, transfers, every trace of her contribution gone, her name deleted, her role rewritten out of history. The early documents, the ones that once listed Grace L. Wells, co-founder, now bore only his signature. Each omission was deliberate. Each file was a quiet betrayal signed in ink. She leaned back, the weight of years pressing down on her. He hadn't just taken credit, he'd taken her existence from the story they'd built together. Her heart ached, but the pain wasn't sharp. It was steady, methodical, like realization settling in. Grace didn't cry. She'd wasted too many tears on the illusion of partnership. Instead, she opened a new folder and began to copy everything. Every email, every contract, every hidden account. The soft hum of the computer filled the room, steady as a heartbeat. She transferred the files to a small silver flash drive, one she kept for lesson plans back when she still taught. She slipped it into her desk drawer, locking it away like a secret promise. When Richard returned the next morning, the front door clicked open with his usual careless confidence. He smelled of champagne and victory, his tie loosened, his smile smug. "You're up early," he said, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't publicly replaced her hours ago. Grace stood by the window, a coffee cup in her hand she hadn't bothered to fill. "You erased me," she said quietly. Her tone wasn't angry. It was factual, steady. He froze, just long enough for her to see the flicker of guilt cross his face before it vanished. "Grace," he sighed, setting his jacket down. "Don't be dramatic." It was necessary. Necessary? Her voice was calm, almost eerily so. "To pretend I never existed? It's business," he said simply, like the word itself absolved him. "You don't understand how this world works. Investors need a clean story. One name, one face. It's strategy." Grace stared at him for a long moment, realizing she was looking at a stranger. "And what about loyalty?" she asked. He smirked faintly, pouring himself a drink though it was barely 8 in the morning. "Loyalty doesn't build empires, Grace. Results do." Something inside her shifted. It wasn't rage. It was final clarity. She set her empty cup down on the counter and turned away from him, not because she was defeated, but because she finally knew what came next. He thought he'd erased her, but he'd only given her reason to start again. And this time she would build something he couldn't touch. The morning Grace left, the city was just waking up. Sunlight spilled between the towers of glass like a promise she wasn't sure she believed yet. She moved through the penthouse in silence, careful not to wake the ghosts that still lived there. The sound of Richard's laughter, the echo of old dreams. Every drawer she opened was a memory. Every photograph she passed was a lie frozen in time. She didn't take much, just her laptop, her mother's worn Bible, and the folder labeled Truth. Everything else she left behind. The house no longer felt like hers. only a monument to someone else's ambition. She packed quietly, her movements deliberate, methodical. The wedding ring on her finger caught the morning light. For a moment, she stared at it, feeling the familiar indentation it had left on her skin over the years. Then she slipped it off and set it on his desk, right on top of the last contract he'd signed without her name. It was the only signature that still belonged to her. She wrote the note on plain stationery. No emotion, no flourish. Just truth. You built a kingdom without its queen. Now rule it alone. She folded it neatly and placed it beside his watch, the one she'd gifted him when his company first reached $1 million valuation. It had been engraved with, "To the man who dreams and the woman who believes." The irony burned now, but she didn't let herself linger. Grace took one last look around. The place was immaculate, sterile, like it had already forgotten them. The air smelled faintly of Richard's cologne and expensive emptiness. She grabbed her bag and walked out, closing the door behind her with a soft click that sounded like finality. When Richard returned later that morning, he found the note first. He laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "She'll be back," he told Victoria, who lounged on the couch in one of Grace's silk robes, sipping coffee she hadn't brewed. "Women like her always come back." Victoria smiled faintly, not bothering to answer. Even she knew arrogance when she heard it. But Grace didn't come back. She took a train across town and rented a small apartment above a bookstore that smelled of dust and possibility. The owner, an older man named Samuel, offered her a part-time job cataloging titles. She accepted without hesitation. There was something comforting about touching stories that had survived longer than the people who wrote them. The shelves were lined with words from women who had lived through loss and found themselves again in ink and paper. Grace ran her fingers over their spines like introductions to friends she hadn't met yet. The first night, she sat on the floor beside the window with a cup of tea and listened to the city hum below her. No marble floors, no curated silence, just life, honest, unpolished, and hers. The quiet felt different here, not heavy like the silence of her old home, but restorative, like space finally breathing back. She opened her laptop, the screen glowing faintly against the dark. The folder, labeled Truth, sat in the corner like a living thing. She didn't open it. Not yet. There was no rush. Power was patient when held by the right hands. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping gently against the glass. Grace closed her eyes and whispered a small prayer, one of gratitude, not regret. She wasn't lost. She was beginning again. For the first time in years, she felt weightless, not because she had nothing, but because everything she carried now was hers alone. Grace built her new life the way she once built Richard's empire, word by word, plan by plan. But this time, every brick bore her own name. It started quietly, almost accidentally. A friend of the bookstore owner came in one afternoon, a young woman trying to start a catering business but lost in the labyrinth of paperwork and proposals. She'd heard Grace had a gift with words. Grace smiled, uncertain, but offered to take a look. She stayed up half the night rewriting the proposal, shaping it the way she used to sculpt Richard's pitches, clear, compelling, and impossible to ignore. The woman won the grant. 2 weeks later, her cousin came calling, and then a friend of that cousin, and soon Grace found herself surrounded by people with dreams, but no roadmap. She recognized them instantly. They were her, years ago. She started calling her consulting work Lee and Company Strategies, not because she had a company yet, but because saying it aloud made it feel inevitable. She worked from the small desk in her apartment, between stacks of books and the constant hum of the city below. Her laptop became her world again, but this time the late nights didn't feel like sacrifice. They felt like resurrection. Each new client reminded her that her voice had always been powerful. It had just been buried beneath someone else's shadow. Word spread faster than she expected. Within months, her inbox filled with inquiries. Women starting hair care lines, tech startups led by young Black founders, nonprofits fighting to fund community schools. They came to her not just for business plans, but for belief, and Grace gave it freely. She charged modest fees at first, but as her clients won grants, partnerships, and respect, her rates grew with her confidence. Every success story felt like reclaiming a piece of the life Richard had tried to erase. One night, as she organized files, she opened the folder labeled Truth. Inside were the same documents she'd taken from his office, proof of shady transfers and hidden accounts. She studied them again, this time not with anger, but with understanding. They were her leverage if she ever needed it, her quiet insurance against the man who'd once told her loyalty didn't build empires. She smiled to herself. Loyalty didn't, but integrity did. While Grace's world blossomed with quiet purpose, Richard's began to crack. It started with a single call from an auditor requesting clarification on an account transfer. Then came questions from investors, whispers in meetings, and canceled partnerships that made his jaw tighten behind closed doors. Victoria tried to fix it. Her charm, once intoxicating, now grating under pressure. "You're overreacting," she told him one night. "It's just numbers." But Richard knew better. He'd built a tower too high, too fast, on foundations Grace had once stabilized. Without her, it was beginning to tilt. He began to notice the silence. The calls that used to fill his mornings with validation grew fewer. The parties he was invited to became smaller. The investors who once praised his genius now sent polite emails ending with, "We're moving in another direction." For the first time in years, Richard Wells tasted doubt. Grace, meanwhile, stood on the other side of that silence and found peace in it. Her name was being spoken again, but this time with respect. The woman they had once overlooked was becoming a force whispered about in boardrooms and community halls alike. She wasn't chasing power anymore. She was building it, one story, one woman, one truth at a time. And somewhere in the quiet of her bookstore apartment, between the smell of paper and the glow of her screen, Grace realized she didn't need to destroy Richard's empire to win. She only needed to create one that outlasted his. The news broke on a Wednesday morning, as most disasters do, ordinary at first, then catastrophic by noon. Wells' development under investigation for financial misconduct. The headlines read, printed in bold letters across every major paper. Reporters camped outside the glass tower Richard once bragged about owning outright. Former investors suddenly couldn't remember when they'd last spoken to him. His phone buzzed nonstop, messages piling up from lawyers, board members, and publicists, each one a different shade of panic. He didn't read most of them. He just kept calling Grace. When she finally answered, her voice was steady, unbothered, like she'd been expecting this moment. "Grace," he said, almost pleading, "you still have influence. The community respects you. If you speak to the press, they'll listen. They'll believe this was just an accounting mistake." There was a pause, long enough for him to think she might have hung up. Then came her reply, quiet but precise. "I tried fixing you for 10 years, Richard. You didn't want a partner. You wanted a mirror. And now you're broken, and all that's left is the reflection." She didn't wait for him to respond. The line clicked dead, leaving only silence and the faint echo of her words. 2 days later, Victoria was gone. No confrontation, no warning. Just a note left on the marble countertop that read, "I didn't sign up to drown with you." She'd transferred what remained of the company's liquid assets into an offshore account before the investigators could freeze them. Richard didn't even bother calling her. He just poured a drink at 10 in the morning and sat in the living room staring at the empty space she'd left behind, realizing it looked a lot like every space in his life now. The board demanded his resignation by Friday. They called it protective restructuring, but everyone knew it meant exile. The same men who had once toasted him under chandeliers now spoke in hushed voices about optics and reputation management. By the end of the week, his office was cleared out. The security guard, one who had once greeted him with "Good morning, Mr. Wells," now avoided his eyes as he carried the last box of his belongings to the elevator. At home, the silence was unbearable. He'd built a mansion too big for a single man to survive in. The walls seemed to echo his downfall back to him. The staff had quit or been laid off, the parties had stopped, and the lights from the city below looked like judgment. He wandered from room to room, touching things that no longer meant anything. Trophies, framed covers of magazines declaring him the visionary of the year, the award still engraved with his name. He picked it up once, weighed it in his hands, then set it down again. It felt hollow. The media tore him apart piece by piece. Every headline bled with irony. The visionary who couldn't see it coming. The fall of a titan. His charm didn't work in interviews anymore. His apologies sounded like rehearsed lines from an old play no one cared to watch. For the first time, Richard Wells didn't know what to say to save himself. One evening, he caught his reflection in the window, his hair thinner, his suit looser, his eyes dull where ambition used to burn. He looked like a man fading from his own story. Somewhere across town, he knew Grace was still working, still building, her light growing brighter as his dimmed. He wondered if she ever thought about him. Not the man he became, but the one she believed he could have been. The thought stung, not because he missed her, but because he finally understood that she had been right all along. Empires built on lies don't crumble, they dissolve, quietly, completely, until nothing remains but the echo of what could have been. Grace stood at the podium with her hands resting lightly on the edge, her reflection glimmering in the polished surface. The room was full, journalists, city officials, developers, all waiting to capture a moment that symbolized something larger than business. For the first time, Grace didn't feel small in a room like this. She didn't feel like she had to justify her place in it. She was no longer the woman in the shadows of someone else's empire. She was the architect of her own. The redevelopment contract had been years in the making, a major project to revitalize several neighborhoods that Wells Development once promised to transform, but never did. When the city reopened the bidding after Richard's collapse, Grace hesitated at first. Taking over what he'd abandoned felt too poetic, too dangerous. But her team, mostly women she'd mentored through Lee and company strategies, had encouraged her to go for it. "You can't rebuild what's broken," one of them told her. "You can only build something new." Now here she was, standing in front of the same cameras that had once ignored her. The cream suit she wore wasn't chosen for show, but for peace. It matched her calm. Her words flowed easily. She spoke about integrity, transparency, and community, about how cities should be built not just for profit, but for people. The applause that followed was warm, genuine. Flashbulbs flickered like tiny stars, but this time Grace didn't flinch under the light. She had earned it. When the ceremony ended, the mayor approached her, shaking her hand firmly. "Mrs. Lee," he said with a smile, "you've set a new standard for leadership." She thanked him politely, the same way she used to thank people who had once called her Richard's wife. But now the title felt distant, irrelevant. No one saw her that way anymore. After the event, she walked through the city square with her team. The air smelled of rain and new beginnings. The women behind her, Architects, planners, designers laughed as they talked about the future phases of the project. Grace let their voices fill the space between buildings, a sound richer than any applause. These were the women she'd lifted, the ones who'd started with small ideas and bigger courage. Watching them reminded her of the life she'd almost lost, and the one she'd built instead. Later that evening, she returned to her apartment above the bookstore, though she could have afforded a penthouse now. The old floorboards still creaked, the book still smelled of dust and wisdom, and Samuel, the owner, still waved at her from behind the counter like she was family. She brewed tea and sat by the window, looking out at the skyline she no longer feared. Somewhere out there, Richard was probably watching her on the news. The thought didn't sting. It didn't thrill her either. It simply existed, like an echo of a past she'd already outgrown. Her phone buzzed. A message from a young woman she'd mentored years ago. "You showed us it's possible," it read. Grace smiled softly, tracing the words with her thumb. She had learned that victory didn't need an audience. Power didn't need noise. Real success was quiet. It moved through rooms gently but left them changed. As the city lights flickered below, Grace whispered a small thank you, not to Richard, not even to fate, but to herself. For walking away, for believing again, for building something that couldn't be taken. She took a sip of her tea, closed her eyes, and let the silence settle around her. The kind that didn't erase, but affirmed. The kind that sounded, finally, like peace. The ballroom was full again, but this time it felt different. The same chandeliers that once cast harsh light on her humiliation now shimmered softly above a crowd that knew her name. Grace moved through the sea of polished faces with a calm that came from peace, not performance. The charity gala was in support of women-led businesses, an initiative her firm had helped fund. Her name was on the banner behind the stage, her work celebrated as a model of ethical rebuilding. She hadn't expected to feel emotional, but when she saw the young entrepreneurs she'd mentored taking pictures and laughing, she realized how far she'd come from that first night outside the Grand Meridian doors. The air hummed with conversation, the soft clink of glasses and the slow rhythm of jazz from the live band. Grace was speaking with a city official when she noticed a small commotion near the entrance. Whispers, glances, the subtle tension that rippled through a room when something didn't belong. She followed their gaze and saw him. Richard Wells. He was almost unrecognizable. His once perfect posture was gone, his frame thinner, his face drawn. The suit he wore, though expensive, hung loosely on him like borrowed dignity. The people around him shifted, unsure whether to greet him or pretend they hadn't noticed. Scandal leaves a stain that no tailoring can hide. Grace didn't move. She simply watched as he scanned the room until his eyes found hers. He hesitated, then began to walk toward her. Conversations dimmed, as if the air itself had decided to listen. People stepped aside, not for him, but for her. When he finally stopped in front of her, the silence was almost sacred. "Grace," he said softly, his voice stripped of its old authority. "You look, well." His attempt at small talk felt fragile, almost human. Grace smiled politely. "I am." He nodded, his hands twisting slightly in front of him. "You won." The words weren't bitter. They were an admission, the kind that takes more courage than pride ever allows. Grace held his gaze for a moment, her expression unreadable. "No," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "I healed." The simplicity of it disarmed him more than any accusation could. Richard looked down, his eyes tracing the floor like he could find forgiveness there. "I never realized how much of me was built by you until you left," he confessed. "You were the part that made everything work. I just never saw it." Grace's smile didn't reach her eyes. but it wasn't cruel. It was compassionate in the way strength can be. "That's because you never looked at me," she said quietly. "Not until I walked away." He flinched at her honesty, but there was no venom in it, only truth. Around them, the party resumed, cautious at first, then naturally, as if the world had decided to keep moving. Grace turned slightly, enough to let him see the line of people waiting to speak with her. The women she'd mentored, the officials who sought her partnership, the journalists who wanted her perspective. She belonged here now, not because of him, but despite him. "Grace," he said again, almost whispering, "I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed to tell you I finally understand." She looked at him for a long moment. "Understanding comes late for some people," she replied softly, "but late is still better than never." Then she extended her hand, not in reconciliation, but closure. He took it, his grip uncertain, and for the first time in their history, she was the one who let go first. As she turned back to the crowd, the light caught her just right, steady, golden, whole. Richard stood watching, realizing too late that some losses aren't punishments. They're the price of blindness. And Grace Lee had never shone brighter than in the moment she no longer needed to be seen. The question hung in the air like a challenge wrapped in politeness. "Mrs. Wells, would you like to stand with your husband for a photo?" The word husband sliced through the hum of the room. Conversations faltered, laughter dimmed. Even the band hesitated between notes. Grace felt every eye shift toward her, waiting to see whether she'd step back into a title she'd already outgrown. Richard froze beside her, half hope flickering in his eyes, the kind of hope born not from love, but habit. The crowd wanted a picture of redemption, of a fallen man and the woman gracious enough to forgive him. But Grace wasn't there to perform a narrative for their comfort. She turned toward him slowly, her expression calm, almost tender, though her voice carried the precision of truth. "I'm not his wife anymore," she said, each word deliberate, steady. "I'm the woman who built what he broke." The silence that followed was deep and electric. The journalist lowered her microphone as if realizing she'd just witnessed something larger than a soundbite. Cameras clicked anyway, instinctively capturing the moment history shifted its focus. For once, the flash favored Grace, not the man who used to command it. Richard's jaw tightened, not from anger, but from the sting of reality. For years, he'd stood at the center of every room, while Grace's light had been treated like reflection, beautiful, but secondary. Now she stood radiant on her own, the air around her filled with quiet authority. "Grace," he murmured, but it was too late. The name sounded foreign in his mouth now, like a word he no longer had the right to say. The journalist thanked her softly, still stunned, and turned away to send the photo to her editor. The crowd, slowly recovering from the shock, began to applaud. It wasn't loud or frenzied, it was reverent. People who once whispered her name in pity now spoke it with respect. Grace gave a polite nod, then excused herself, stepping away from the press lights and the noise that had once defined her humiliation. Outside, the night air felt cool and clean. The city glittered around her, familiar and forgiving. She took a slow breath, grounding herself in the rhythm of her own heartbeat. Behind her, through the tall glass doors, she could see Richard standing alone, still framed by chandeliers and ghosts of his former glory. For a moment, she almost felt sorry for him, almost. Because despite everything, he looked exactly like the man she'd left, surrounded by brightness that never belonged to him. She walked toward her car, her heels clicking softly against the marble steps. As she reached the curb, one of the younger women from her firm ran after her, phone in hand. "Ms. Lee," she said breathlessly, "you need to see this." She turned the screen toward Grace, The photo was already online, her standing poised, composed, speaking those now viral words. Beneath it, the headline glowed. Grace Lee Wells, the woman who rose without revenge. Grace studied it for a long moment. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. Instead, she handed the phone back gently. "It's not about revenge," she said. "It's about remembrance. Women like us deserve to be seen for more than our survival." The young woman nodded, eyes bright with admiration. Grace placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder before stepping into the waiting car. As it pulled away from the curb, she looked out at the city she'd helped shape, not with power stolen, but with power reclaimed. In the ballroom behind her, Richard remained frozen under the lights, the applause fading into something like mourning. The world had finally turned its gaze from him to her, not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it. And somewhere deep inside, Grace understood that real victory didn't roar. It simply stood tall, silent, and undeniable, just like her. The Grand Meridian shimmered under the city's evening glow, its glass facade catching the light like a monument to everything Grace had once been denied. A year ago, she had stood outside those same doors, trembling in the winter cold, waiting for permission to be acknowledged. Tonight, the valet opened them for her before she even reached the top step. Her name was printed in gold on every program. Keynote speaker, Grace Lee, founder and CEO of Lee and Company Strategies. The ballroom looked almost identical to that night of humiliation, but it no longer felt like a place of exile. It felt like arrival. The chandeliers still dripped with gold and crystal, but this time their light fell on her, not through her. Conversations quieted as she entered, and for a brief moment, the entire room turned to look at her, not with judgment, but awe. The same men and women who once treated her like a shadow now whispered her name like it carried weight. Grace moved gracefully through them, dressed in a sleek white gown that glowed softly under the lights, the color of renewal. Her head was high, her stride unhurried. The board members who had once overlooked her were now standing near the front, ready to greet her with warm smiles and words like visionary and inspiring. They didn't know that she didn't need their approval anymore. Grace had built something larger than their acceptance. She had built her own table. The city officials who had once entertained Richard's charm now sought her counsel. Even the mayor had asked for a private meeting earlier that week. Power, Grace had learned, was quiet until it no longer had to be. In the crowd, she spotted Daniel Hart, tall, reserved, the kind of man whose wealth spoke through his actions, not his arrogance. He had been one of the first to invest in her new initiative, a program supporting minority-owned startups. When they met, he hadn't asked about her marriage or her past. He'd asked about her vision. Tonight, he smiled at her from across the room, a gesture of respect rather than ownership. It was the first smile in years that didn't remind her of compromise. When the MC called her name, the applause began before she reached the stage. She placed her notes on the podium but didn't look down. Her voice was steady, her words deliberate. "They tried to exclude me," she began, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "But you can't exclude a woman who knows her worth. Because worth isn't given, it's remembered, it's reclaimed." The room fell utterly silent as she spoke about integrity, about the cost of erasure, about rebuilding not from revenge but from purpose. Every word carried the weight of truth and the grace of forgiveness. When she finished, there was no hesitation, only a standing ovation that filled the room like thunder. But it wasn't guilt that lifted people to their feet. It was reverence. Outside, across the street, Richard Wells stood alone. His suit was clean but old, his posture smaller somehow, as if he'd finally learned what humility felt like. Through the glass, he could see her on stage, radiant, self-assured, surrounded by light that no longer belonged to him. The music swelled inside, and he realized the truth with painful clarity. The woman they had tried to erase had become the legacy. When the gala ended, the great glass doors opened automatically as Grace stepped out, laughter trailing behind her like music. The cold air met her skin, gentle this time, no longer a punishment, but a reminder. She paused for a moment, breathing in the night, feeling the world shift around her. She didn't look back at the building or the man watching from the shadows. She didn't need to. The past was behind her. The doors had already closed on it. And this time, they opened for her, automatically. If this story moved you, share it. Because, somewhere, another woman is standing outside a door she helped build, wondering if she still belongs. Remind her that grace isn't weakness, and silence isn't surrender. It's the moment before the world finally learns her name. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been overlooked and risen anyway? Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, drop a comment, and share it with a friend. And don't forget to subscribe to Black Stories Untold for more stories that uncover hidden struggles, celebrate strength, and remind us that every voice matters.